Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. As we are recording this episode, the situation in the Middle East between Israel and Iran is extremely dangerous. Perhaps we might even face a new war. We also know about the situation in Ukraine, and Ukraine is in war. But there are also more regional conflicts around the world, often overlooked by media. But also we receive some information from East Asia, in particular from China, North Korea, Russia, about the possible or potential threats. On the other hand, there is a great book, Long Peace of East Asia, written by my guest today, Professor Timo Kivimäki. So what can we learn from his research about East Asia? Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Professor Kivimäki is a professor of international relations at the University of Bath, United Kingdom, and also a senior fellow at Sejong Institute in Seoul, Republic of Korea. He focuses on assessing the contribution of various social scientific paradigms to peace research. For example, in his new books, Protecting the Global Civilian from Violence, UN Discourses and Practices in Fragile States, and the second book, Failure to Protect the Path to the Consequences of Humanitarian Interventionism, Professor Kivimäki reveals new patterns in contemporary warfare by looking at political discourses and cases of unilateral humanitarian intervention and UN peacekeeping. But let's go back 10 years when the book Long Peace of East Asia was published. And this is a very interesting topic because not many scholars and researchers are looking at this region when it comes to peace research. So, first question, what inspired you to study the East Asia and peace phenomenon?
Well, I think originally my interest was in the fact that we normally look at Western experience. So when we try to find lessons of how to prevent war, yet the West hasn't been terribly effective in the prevention of war. And so that's why I became quite interested in the way, first, how Southeast Asian nations, especially the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, managed in a very different way to our Western ways. It managed to develop peace. So that was the starting point. Later, I then discovered that hey, this is since after the 1970s, this was the pattern in the entire East Asia, that with the same type of strategy, they managed to be very effective in the prevention of organized violence. So that's the starting point of my interest in East Asia and peace.
And as a scholar coming from the West, in your case it's Finland, did you face any challenges?
It is true that there is great kind of liberal resistance towards evidence and interpretations that suggest that liberal democracies too should respect the sovereignty of other countries. When I've shown that with the exception of just one case, Western humanitarian interventions, for example, have ended up killing the people these interventions were intended to protect, either during or after the operation, and in most cases both, during and after. This conclusion has been very difficult to sell, despite the quite clear evidence. So I tend to produce evidence and interpretations and scholarship that is extremely unpopular. We don't want to admit that some of our good intentions lead to bad outcomes. And even more, perhaps, we don't want to admit that there are lessons worth learning outside Europe and North America. It's difficult to convince people that East Asians do it better when it comes to conflict prevention.
So let's start with the obvious question, and that's the definition of the long peace of East Asia. Like when we hear this, what can we imagine? Like what's behind?
Well, when I talk about the long peace of East Asia, I talk about a strange development. East Asia used to be the most belligerent region in the world until the end of 1970s. It produced some 80% of global fatalities of organized violence. After 1979, it has produced only about less than 5% of global fatalities, despite the fact that they have almost 1/3 of the world's population. So this is what I refer to when I talk about the long peace of East Asia. It is after 1979, and it is in the area that consists of ASEAN countries, so Southeast Asia, plus China, Japan, Korea, and Mongolia. And it's related to the lack of fatalities or a small number of fatalities of organized violence. And by organized violence, I mean conflicts with or without states, but also authoritarian violence and terrorist violence against civilians. So that's what I talk about when I talk about the long peace of East Asia.
And can we distinguish between long peace and, like, let's say, other peace in regional perspective of the East Asia?
There's a research program that looked at East Asian peace, and I felt that when we talk about East Asian peace, we assume that there is some permanence in this peace, but I wanted to recognize that this peace can go terribly wrong. I mean, it may be that there's a war in Taiwan or in Korea tomorrow. And I don't want to rule that out. I mean, it is a possibility. People can make bad decisions. So that's why I thought that I kind of borrowed this concept where we cannot talk about permanence of peace somewhere. It is just a long period of peace. So that's why I used that name.
When I read the book, there are few elements or concepts that we should go through to better clarify your theory and your approach. And the first is the principle of non-interference. So what's the connection between the principle of non-interference and the reduction of conflict escalation in East Asia?
I think it's quite clear that non-interference has been a great contribution to East Asian peace. When East Asia was very belligerent, the biggest wars in East Asia were wars that foreign powers interfered in. I mean, Vietnam War is the biggest war after the Second World War, and obviously it was interfered by quite many countries. Korean War was the most intensive war if we look at fatalities per month. After the Second World War, that was also interfered by quite many. In fact, 2/3 of fatalities of organized violence in East Asia are from conflicts that started out as intrastate conflicts. So intrastate dispute, like in Korea and in Vietnam, about governance, whether it is communist or capitalist governance. It starts with intrastate kind of dispute, but then it gets internationalized. And this is what I mean by I mean this has contributed to 2/3 of fatalities of organized violence in East Asia. Now, the interesting thing is then when you look at when these fatalities were produced, and I did that in my book, A Long Peace of East Asia, and I discovered that 98% of the fatalities were produced after international powers had entered the conflict. So quite clearly, interference created a lot of escalation in East Asian wars. Once all that stopped at the end of 1970s, East Asian countries simply refused to accept foreign interference, and they stopped interfering in each other's wars. As a result, 95% of average annual fatalities of conflict and other types of organized violence simply disappeared. Only 5% remained. So that was quite important occasion. The norm of non-interference is quite crucial for East Asian peace.
And what do you think is the source of the non-interference sort of mentality or thinking?
I think the difference there is that in the West, we, especially currently, we have this feeling that we have kind of stable norms that we can enforce. This is different in East Asia. I mean, they feel that first of all, that each country can define its own solutions. It is not useful to impose solutions from outside. And also, they feel that negotiation and dialogue is important simply because of the fact that what we feel as clearly justice, I mean, justice that we should enforce, the other party will probably also feel that way of its own solutions. So if we both enforce our solutions, the outcome cannot be anything but escalation of conflict. So in that sense, I think it's quite different, this type of thinking in East Asia. That's why they simply rather continue to have a dialogue. It sounds very efficient for us, instead of enforcing the right solution, as we often do.
Some people might ask if there is that concept of non-interference. Does it basically preserve sort of regime within the countries and sort of maybe violence when we have authoritarian regimes? So how to work with this argument in connection to your book or theory?
There are several. I think this is a very good question because of the fact that it is one of the main arguments. Well, if we don't interfere into atrocities by countries, then they can do that with impunity. Now, my argument has been that if you look at the history of authoritarian violence, if you look at the most horrible histories of authoritarian violence, they tend to be justified by foreign interference. I mean, dictators get justifications for their dictatorship, their denial of democracy, but also their atrocities by referring to security. We have to suppress these people because of security threats. We have to use these authoritarian measures because of threats. Now, if there is an extra threat of foreign intervention, that adds to the menu of choice for justifications of authoritarian violence. I give you examples. I mean, not even from East Asia. I mean, Russia tends to emphasize the need to protect Russian people in Ukraine, so ethnic Russians in Ukraine. There has been I mean, they claim that there's discrimination. I mean, their language was removed from the language of official languages. Now, then Russia started protecting these people. What happened? I mean, those people ended up in a much worse position because of the fact that then it was easy to say that these people are supported by a foreign power and these people are maybe conspiring with the foreign power. As a result, they are more legitimate targets. The same can be said about victims of terror in Iran or in Iraq or in Syria. Both terrorists and authoritarians, authoritarian leaders, explicitly justify their authoritarian violence or their terrorist violence by saying, "Look, we are threatened by foreigners." As a result, it is really that very often that threat that interference poses is being used as a source of legitimacy for violence and also legitimacy for not allowing democratic reforms.
I also received an interesting question from students regarding to Spain. And they asked me, like, the West intervene in Kosovo or elsewhere, but why the West doesn't intervene in the West itself? Because there was a conflict in Basque. We have the example from the Northern Ireland as well. So there are more examples also in the West which are very similar to those that the West intervened. Who has the right to intervene and where? So that's just my remark to your.
Yeah. It's actually true that, I mean, if that's an additional reason why one shouldn't kind of enforce norms, because if one doesn't enforce norms kind of systematically, that the same norm is for Kosovo and the Basque country, the same norm is for Northern Ireland as for Ossetia, South Ossetia. If you don't do that systematically and unilateral powers don't, then you have difficulties in enforcing norms.
The second concept I found was the role of developmentalism. Difficult word, but it sounds pretty logical. Developmentalism. But how is this connected to sustaining peace?
It's quite clear. I mean, and this is quite global, but in East Asia, it's quite clear that the attitude that countries have towards development affect their willingness to fight wars. Because of course you cannot fight wars you cannot fight wars if you want development. If your factories are destroyed every year by the war, obviously you don't develop. If you have so that's kind of, it's logical to believe that this new development obsession that East Asia started having at the end of 1970s is an important contribution to East Asian peace.
The next question is related to the role of China and ASEAN. Those two, they have sort of like space divide. This is China and sphere of influence, and then we have ASEAN countries grouped together as Southeast Asia, and they have sort of own way of discussing the problems and bringing the solutions. So how these two phenomena connect to your theory?
I think there are certain similarities that are the backbone of East Asian peace, because I think in East Asian peace it's quite important that all countries feel ownership of the peace. Now, Chinese elite talks about anti-hegemonism, which basically is the same thing as ASEAN principle of non-interference. So to some extent, even though it is the same thing, it is quite good that there are two concepts or several concepts so that both sides feel that this is our principle, because I think an important part of the East Asian peace is the fact that it is a product that everybody feels ownership of. It's not imposed on anybody. So those parts fit together nicely. Obviously, there is a considerable tension between ASEAN and China because of the fact that China has grown so big and important. Whatever China does affects everybody else so tremendously, and then it's difficult to stick to non-interference. Even when anything China does, even domestically, affects so crucially intra-state affairs in the other countries.
I read about sort of face-saving strategies in your book, and that was quite interesting for me because in the West, when you speak about saving your face, that's something we don't speak that a lot about, and especially, for instance, in the United Kingdom, we see how many scandals we have in the government and how many leaks are getting to the public and all those things. And suddenly you speak or you write about this face-saving strategies. So can you explain this to us?
It's something that is talked about a lot in East Asia, that when you have a dispute, you have to come out of the dispute in a way that offers your opponent also a victory. I'll give you a excellent example. I assisted the peace process in Aceh. There, the Achenese province was fighting for independence, and obviously they couldn't get independence, but they were fighting to install their their sultan into prominence in that province. Now, Indonesian government, instead of defeating Aceh, instead of defeating their opponent, they offered a cultural institution of Wali Nagro. That translates as head of state, except that Wali Nagro was a cultural, not a political institution. But because of this, the rebels in Aceh could feel that, yes, we were fighting for our Wali Nagro, and now there is Wali Nagro. There is a head of state we were fighting for. So they could end up the conflict with victory, yet even though they were kind of, allowed to be Achenese, they also could be Indonesians because they already had the Wali Nagro. So in a way, instead of imposing the just solution like we tend to do in the West, if we have a democratic process, we have to enforce democracy here and there because we know that democracy is good. We know that this and that norm is good, so we impose that norm. This is not the way how East Asia functions. It recognizes that what you feel as a just solution may not be what I feel as a just solution. So if we both impose our own solutions and enforce those solutions, the only thing that comes out of it is escalation. Instead, we should try to find ways in which we both can win. And this is what face saving is all about. It's about letting both win. It's actually interesting. If you look at the statistics of conflict termination, you realize that once East Asia became peaceful, it stopped ending conflicts with military victory. Because, victorious military operation is imposing your solution on the loser of that military confrontation. That simply, there's almost no conflicts with that have ended in military victory. And that, I think, is because of the kind of consolidation consolidation of the idea of face saving. I think it has been a very good norm. It has contributed to peace in East Asia.
And when we put another layer, which is the economic interdependence, how this works together in the context of the peace. Because we know that in East Asia, the economic development and all we already said is so connected to money in some way. So how this influence the peace and your thinking?
I think quite many people would like to conclude that it is interdependence that created peace in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. I don't agree with that. Two reasons. Interdependence was very high among some of the conflicting countries. I'll give you an example. In the middle of 1960s, 90% of Indonesia's exports went through Singapore. And suddenly, Indonesia declared war against Malaysia, including Singapore, despite the fact that it basically destroyed its own exports. This is because of the fact that they didn't care about the economic development. Only once they started caring about economic development, that's when interdependence became important. So interdependence as such does not cause peace. Only once it is appreciated. It's also in ASEAN during the 1970s when ASEAN peace was consolidated. That's when ASEAN countries clearly showed the world that they could live without fighting each other. That's a time when objective economic interdependence declined. But what was new was that all ASEAN countries were obsessed to develop. So therefore, whatever little of positive economic interdependence there was very much valued. So it is the valuation of development and valuation of economic interdependence that gives rise to peace, not the objective fact as such.
Is there any other interdependence that you discovered or during the research maybe you come across when researching East Asia?
I think to some extent the success of ASEAN became a bit of a kind of identity question. When people in the world started looking at ASEAN as a success story, it was important for ASEAN countries to make it a success because it was prestige for them. So to some extent, that kind of interdependence, a kind of identity of interdependence became an issue there also. Yeah.
What about weak points of your theory? I know this is sort of like that you are self-criticizing yourself, which is what people might do, and we scholars, we always do. We criticize our work and we receive the feedback from reviewers because we want to know what people think and we want to get better in our writings and our work. So when we have your theory and we discuss many concepts, now let's discuss a little bit the weaknesses or weak points, or where do you see sort of shortcomings that require more research and more effort to explain?
I think the main weak point that I see in this idea of thinking that East Asian peace is based on mainly based on non-interference and developmentalism. The clear weak point there is the fact that the least unlikely conflicts are related to areas where neither affect. Think about it. Normally, you don't fight wars because of your development orientation. What if there's a disputed territory that has a lot of oil that is crucial for your development? Obviously, then there is no positive interdependence. There's just negative interdependence. If the Philippines gets this oil, China doesn't get it. As a result, China doesn't have this developmental resource. So in that sense, that's one side. the other side is that if we then look at this disputed territory that China says this belongs to us, Philippines says this belongs to us, you cannot respect sovereignty there. You cannot comply with the norm of non-interference into somebody else's internal affairs in an area that you claim is your own area. So in these disputed territories, nobody can respect sovereignty. Nobody can respect non-interference simply because of the fact that they say, this is mine, this is our territory. So in that sense, those two things, I mean, when I build a theory of how East Asia can build its own and has built its own peace, those are the difficult points because there is a special issue area where neither of the main pillars of peace can be applied.
And one of the difficult area for me to understand is when you have a principle of non-interference, there is a disaster, sort of nature catastrophe or some disaster, and then the country needs the humanitarian aid or intervention in some way. What happens when these two collide in some way?
Well, I mean, I think I was in Myanmar when something like this happened, the Nargis natural disaster, and things were developing within ASEAN quite nicely because obviously the Myanmar was then a military dictatorship, and they didn't allow outsiders into their country as freely as the others would have wanted to. And then suddenly France says that we could do a kind of assisting humanitarian intervention there and force our forces into that country. As a result, for a month, the junta did not even talk about allowing any foreigners in their, well, I mean, any foreigners in a massive kind of role in that catastrophe. So that threat of a military involvement actually made it so much more difficult for humanitarian workers to enter the country. As soon as it became less threatening for Myanmar and Myanmar's political system, it was easier for them to allow humanitarian workers come there. I don't believe in enforcement of, and I don't believe in military humanitarianism. So far, it has only produced fatalities. It has often killed the people that it intended to protect.
Another good question would be, when I read your book, I was thinking about regimes. China, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, Russia, all countries, they have sort of different level of regime. And then we have the notion of democratization, which is proposed usually by the collective West. So I have two questions related to this. The first one, how is Asian countries understand democracy? Is it the same like we do? And the second question, what about democratization as a notion and long is peace in East Asia?
First question, I think when it comes to democracy, you do have slightly different ideas. Two things that I think are quite fundamentally different, not only between, let's say, China and the US, for example, or China and Europe, but also Japan and the US and Japan and Europe, is the question of individualism versus collectivism. Even though Japan is fundamentally very, very democratic country, or South Korea, there the main focus is on collective well-being, not individual freedom, not individual prosperity, but collective. So collectivism is more pronounced, even to the extent. I give you a fantastic example. In Indonesian language, there's a word, preman, which is a person who doesn't care about others, it's basically a thug, somebody who's just for himself and doesn't care about the collective good. You know, its foundation is in the English word free man. So free man is actually a bad thing in Indonesian culture. If freedom means that you promote your individual kind of interests at the expense of the collective norms. So that's one thing. The other thing is that even though you cannot say that Japan and Korea are social democratic countries or something like that, economic democracy is more important in East Asia than in most, especially in North America. And that basically means that developmentalism in East Asia means development of all, not just the millionaires, not just, and that's part of democracy, not just political rights, but also economic rights. So in those two senses, East Asian democracy is slightly different. Now, whether democracy then challenges the East Asian way of peace, I don't think so, because I think democracy is a system where the people who are subject to a rule can decide upon the way how they are being ruled. Now, if we think of humanitarian interventionism, first of all, democracy works within countries, not between countries. It does work within countries. Now, this means that interference, as long as, let's say, the United States does not allow, let's say, Indonesians to elect American president, and they are unlikely to allow that to Indonesians. As long as this is the case, America should not have power inside Indonesia. Indonesian democracy means that it is Indonesians who decide what Indonesia does. So then intervention is actually anti-democratic because of the fact that the intervener is not represented by the people who they intervene. As a result, I think the non-interference is a democratic principle until the intervener is the UN. And because UN is something that represents all of us. Now, East Asia supports the UN much more. East Asia does not organize interventions outside the UN mandate. So in that respect, also, East Asia is for global democracy also. So in that sense, I don't think that democratization is in any way in contradiction with this principle of non-interference, as long as democracy is mostly about national democracy of a state. It is actually very much compatible with the non-interference and democracy are very compatible with each other.
And when you mention UN, and I'm glad you mentioned UN is associated and it's very often with the peacekeeping missions. But in fact, peacekeeping missions are very complicated and very difficult. So what can we learn from the East Asia when it comes to peacekeeping?
I think several things. In fact, if we compare unilateral humanitarian interventions with UN peacekeeping, we realize that UN peacekeeping operates much more with the principles that East Asia has adopted in its own kind of peace strategy. First of all, UN does not want to impose solutions from outside. This is exactly how East Asia works. It doesn't impose, it doesn't terminate conflicts with victory, but it keeps on having a dialogue. This is how the UN does. It doesn't, and this is what many of our leaders criticize UN for. UN is weaker because it doesn't kind of aggressively impose solutions. We impose solutions. We have military capacity to do that, and as a result, we tend to escalate conflicts. Unilateral interventions tend to escalate conflicts, whereas UN record of peacekeeping is actually tremendously good. UN does reduce fatalities both during and after its operations compared to the situation before. And it is partly because of the fact that it doesn't impose solutions. It also respects sovereignty. UN tries to negotiate an invitation, whereas Russia didn't want an invitation from Ukraine to do its own military operation. The US did not expect an invitation from Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. And it tends to be that once you have certain respect for the sovereignty of countries, even if the countries are undemocratic, not very democratic, it tends to work. Operations tend to work better. I think Iraq is a funny example in this respect. Saddam Hussein was definitely a dictator. He had absolutely no democratic credentials. Yet 90% of Iraqi people, according to a survey by the UK Defense Department, showed that 90% of Iraqi people wanted all the foreigners out instantly, despite the fact that the foreigners managed to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So it is often the case that certain respect for sovereignty is good for de-escalation of conflicts, and that's an East Asian recipe, and that's something that UN peacekeeping missions tend to apply, and that has created, that has improved their track record.
The next question is related to the sort of change or possible attempt to change the world order. We listen more and more voices coming from sort of multipolarity, countries that want to impose that sort of regime globally. And then we have attempts from the United States, from the collective West, to keep that order as it is based on the UN. And some people might ask, how will this influence the long peace in East Asia if there will be multipolarity, or if East Asian countries will be in sort of conflict with the West?
I think I have a very different interpretation of some of the premises of your questions. First of all, the idea that the West wants to maintain UN primacy, I don't think that's the case. I think, for example, what George W. Bush said about the intervention in Iraq in the UN, he came to the Security Council and said, "Look, the UN can follow our lead, or it can be meaningless like the League of Nations." So UN, in order to be relevant, it has to follow the US, not so that the UN is leading the world as a representative organization of all countries. Also, the fact that the West has quite many interventions that are not UN mandated, therefore against the UN Charter. China, for example, doesn't. China doesn't participate in interventions that are not UN interventions. So in that sense, you could say that East Asia tends to follow UN lead much better than the West. So in that sense, I think the East Asian way is more UN centric than the Western way. And the multipolar approach that China, for example, kind of suggests is still kind of, I mean, it doesn't challenge the UN. It just says that there should be many important nations and not one hegemon that dictates terms. Those many many big countries can collaborate and have a dialogue inside the UN, and the UN could still lead. But what China objects is the US leadership, obviously.
And there is also one question which is perhaps from that sort of more radical point of view, and that's argumentation about continuing possible threats in East Asia. For instance, North Korea is firing some missiles over Japan, or China is having some disputes with the neighbors. And people argue why there is no UN peacekeeping mission, or why there is no more involvement of the UN in the area. And I think this is quite a good question when you have your own theory of long peace, to explain people how do you understand that?
I think it's not just that China would object UN participation, let's say in Korea, for example. Certainly, maybe in Taiwan, because it claims that it's not an international issue. I think when we look at conflicts where you have potential participation of countries that can destroy the world, it's kind of understandable that this setting is naturally a setting where those countries that can destroy the world should have a veto power, because if they are not part of the solution, if they are against the solution, they can destroy the world. As a result, I think it is true that you have situations, you have conflicts that the UN simply cannot do anything about, and we cannot change that simply because of the fact that if such countries are involved that can destroy the world, you cannot go against one of them, because they do have a kind of a by being able to destroy the world, they already have a veto, regardless of what the UN rules are. So in that sense, I think the question of Korea's and the question of Taiwan are questions where patient dialogue is the only thing that can work. You cannot enforce a solution against a country that can destroy the world.
And this connects to like one of my case studies that I had, and that was to compare the UN involvement in different areas. And we had a simulation between a Mexican and US border. What would happen if UN Peace Corps was involved in that area? And almost like all people said, but United States would never agree with having UN on its territory. So that's also interesting to think from the power politics, how those big powers accept or they don't accept the UN involvement. Because usually we see the UN involvement in smaller countries. And this is like backed up by, as you said, the big powers with the veto. Doesn't matter if it's formal or informal.
I think it's good to remember that in those issues that are crucial, for the security of one of the nuclear powers, you cannot get a UN operation or any reasonable operation against the will of one of the nuclear powers, simply because of the reasons that I said. You cannot go against a country that can destroy the world. Now, in terms of, let's say, if there was a negotiation on how to fix the border between US and Mexico, I think it would be possible for the UN to do something, but it would have to be something that both the US and Mexico, and especially the US, accepts. I mean, regardless of the rules, even if the Security Council did not have the rule of veto of the five big powers, they would still need to accept that the US has a veto over such an important territory. I mean, what is more problematic, though, I think, is that in those conflicts where the US or Russia takes a leading role, they don't allow a UN operation. I mean, obviously, in Afghanistan, UN had an important role, but not a military role. There was no peacekeeping operation. There hasn't been a peacekeeping operation in Iraq either. The peacekeeping operation in Syria ended as soon as US military role increased. So wherever big powers feel that they have the primary responsibility, there they don't accept UN peacekeeping, and I think this is wrong. They would benefit from a peacekeeping role, because I mean they don't tend to get what they wanted by means of military power anyway.
That's an excellent topic for the whole new episode, but let's go back to your research. And there are like few questions in the last section of our interview. And the first one is, what sort of under-researched areas or gaps do you see when researching long peace in East Asia?
I think one thing that this research, I hope, inspires is to see solutions that are non-Western and whether they make some sense. Because we tend to feel that yes, peace can be achieved by lowering borders and making a European Union everywhere. But there are other ways too. And in East Asia, for example, instead of lowering borders, they actually elevated borders by kind of emphasizing the role of the principle of non-interference. So I think it would be fantastic if my research on East Asian peace inspires other efforts at finding solutions that are a bit out of the box, in the sense that they are not European or Western solutions. So that's one thing. The other thing where I think the main challenge is that I think the main challenge in the research of the long peace of East Asia is really what to do in areas where non-interference cannot be done because of the fact that you don't know whose sovereignty is in this area, and where developmental obsession leads countries to belligerence rather than to peace. When it's about energy resources in disputed territories, I think how to match the existing formula for peace to those areas where clearly that formula cannot be used as such.
The last question for today's interview, Professor, and that's the diversity of researchers. How do you see diversity of researchers and peace research at the moment? And do you see more integration from the non-Western scholars into this research?
On the one hand, I think in general in research, China is coming very strong. I mean, already a couple of years ago, the number one country in terms of publication of scientific papers has been China rather than the US. So I think that's a good thing that there's a Chinese voice there. At the same time, I think in peace research especially, you have two mainstreams that don't seem to change. I mean, you have, on the one hand, you have the correct opinion, which is often very interventionist, liberal, democratic opinion. If you deviate from that, even by showing that, hey, East Asian non-democracies can do something better than democracies, it's very difficult to participate in a debate. On the other hand, then you have a scholarship that is so mathematical and so number-oriented, and often so completely alienated from the realities of conflict. And the problem is that if you are not one of the two, so if you don't represent the right view on world politics, which is the very Western kind of interventionist view, or if you are not a specialist of statistical analysis, you have difficulties in entering the debate. I think you would need that kind of diversity in order to learn from each other. That would be something I would like to see in the future.
Professor Kivimäki, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts, insightful theory of peace that I think not many scholars know, but I hope this episode will encourage people to research beyond the Western thinking and bring some diversity into research that we need, as you mentioned. And I wish you lots of energy to your research, to your writing. I know that you publish many books, many articles, and we would like to see even more and more, because we like reading new ideas, especially in these times when we have so many conflicts, we have wars, and something is not, as we say, something is not right in the world. So thank you again for your time, and thank you again for being on IO Thinker.
Thanks very much. It has been my pleasure.